We're in Melbourne with Jim. How do we pronounce your second? Hlavac. Hlavac. Where does that name come from, Jim?
It's a Czech name, but my background is Croatian.
Okay, so you're European in Australia.
We're in Australia at the moment, yes.
What's your job these days, Jim?
I'm a senior lecturer at Monash University in the Translation and Interpreting Studies program.
Okay, and what languages do you work with?
I work with German, Croatian. I work also from Russian sometimes. I can use Italian sometimes. Macedonian is something I've picked up as well, which I do translation from. Sometimes there's also some, I won't call it interpreting, but I've done a fair bit of interlingual transfer between Macedonian and English as well.
Okay, but you're also a researcher.
That's what I'm also a researcher.
What kind of research are you engaged in?
A number of things. Within translation and interpreting, I've got a few projects happening. One is looking at intercultural communication, particularly in the interpreting space, which is looking at how interpreters manage situations at the micro level with individual speakers, their vernaculars, their attitudes, their moves, their discourse features, etc. At the macro level, where power is invested.
What kind of situations are you looking at?
In particular in healthcare, but also within law, all areas of public service interpreting or community interpreting, as it's perhaps more commonly known here. That's turning into a book project. I've also got projects which are looking at the amenability of interpreting within the healthcare system, and where interpreting turns out to be a cost-saving factor. If you want to measure out the cost saving with interpreting and without interpreting, the elevated levels of misdiagnosis and re-entry to hospitals means that if we don't have interpreters providing the communication channels that we need, we risk lots of things which are actually far more expensive than the provision of interpreting services. So I'm looking at some very compelling evidence to demonstrate this. I'm also
There's evidence from Melbourne.
From Melbourne, yes. These are. I'm collaborating with colleagues at large public hospitals here in Melbourne in collecting this data, and so we're putting out some papers hopefully by the end of this year on that.
Good.
I've got a few other projects, but I don't want to.
Okay, but that's the general thrust of them. You're into
that's the first two.
Community. Yeah. Is Melbourne a good place to do that kind of research?
I think that it is. I think that at the macro level, we have policies in place that, in the first place, allow for a high provision of translation and interpreting services. In reality, there are certainly imperfections, but if you have a national and also at state level a policy framework that firmly supports the provision of interpreting and translation services, or at least the removal of linguistic barriers, then you have the operationalization of this, which is working quite well. You have a quite interesting infrastructure to look at now.
So you're also getting support for the research?
Yes.
Institutional support,
grants, etc. So, and there's increasing. What we see is that interpreting is certainly on the radar of a number of areas. For example, 2 years ago, there was a strong push to address family violence here in Victoria. And one of the aspects of the focus, including funding, was to look at how family violence situations involving victims and perpetrators were interpreted. Because family violence is not just perpetrated by English speakers, there are interpreters involved in situations with police, social workers, solicitors, in the courts, etc. Another case is mental health. Higher rates of diagnosis, conditions such as aphasia, etc., mean that often people who had proficiency in English can lose it in later life, necessitating the need for interpreting services, etc. So that interpreting is sort of, we kind of think ourselves as sometimes on the periphery, and we are in many ways, but it's actually all over the place, all across, not just public services, I think also in industry, and it's interesting to see how private companies also now very readily employ interpreters if they need their bills collected, if they need to deal with customer complaints, if they need to troubleshoot. And Australia is an interesting place because there's a very good provision of languages for residents, migrants typically, who speak languages other than English, but also Auslan, and also indigenous languages. What we have...
Auslan is Australian Sign
Australian
Language.
Sign Language, yes, that's right.
And the indigenous languages?
Indigenous languages are... I might move now to NAATI, which is the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters. Indigenous languages perhaps have been able to benefit by some of the battles fought by migrant languages for the establishment of something such as NAATI. Now, when NAATI was established and a testing...
That's the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters,
which is the organisation here in Australia which manages testing and the certification of people to work as interpreters and translators, that they have at least demonstrated a certain skill level to work as interpreters and translators, even if they might not have gone through training, because at the moment we have a test-only regime, which is changing. Training will become a mandatory part of credentialing from about 2018 onwards. Anyway, interestingly, NAATI covers not only Asian European languages spoken here, or African as well, but also Auslan and Aboriginal languages. Now, Aboriginal languages or Indigenous languages have been overlooked for a long time as part of the culture in this country of overlooking Indigenous Australians. What we can see in the last 20 years, though, is some decent funding being provided for the training for Indigenous language interpreters. I was at a presentation given by people from Northern Territory, and it's fascinating to see how there are cultural as well as linguistic difficulties that interpreters have to negotiate, because you're dealing with terminology which might, let's say, I don't know, bail, which might require a paraphrase in an Indigenous language of, let's say, 2 sentences to fully explain what it refers to, but also cultural notions like poison cousins, which I really didn't know anything about, but there are very strong prohibitions about the interactions that you can have with people who are your in-laws. Now, if an interpreter is interpreting for someone who happens to be an in-law, how do they deal with this if there are social sanctions against interaction? And I was really... Sandra Hale, I think, is also someone who's will confirm this. She's travelled widely across Northern Australia and also Northern Western Australia, and there's been real advances in the training of Indigenous language interpreters, which I think is a great feature. Auslan is also part of the regime of credentialing, so if we look nationally at Australia in comparison to perhaps other countries, we have a very developed, uniform system for all languages other than English under one umbrella, which I think is an advantage as opposed to other countries where these tend to be splintered across separate associations. I'm thinking in particular of North America, but even Europe as well, where that happens.
Jim, let's go back quickly now to your mid-20s or so. Where were you then?
In my mid-20s, I was in Australia. I was teaching English as a second language, and I was also briefly in a job called the Multicultural Education Aid. That included translation and interpreting for recent refugees coming to Melbourne from Yugoslavia, so it was in Croatian mainly.
So you're a practitioner?
That's right, yes. I got my NAATI accreditation a long time ago, probably 25 years ago, if not 30 in fact. Getting old. So yeah, I've been around for a while, but I've done lots of things. I've done more things outside interpreting and translation than inside it, and I've come back to, if you like, translation and interpreting over the last 6-7 years.
Okay. You went off to Europe, though.
That's right. I was then working in Berlin, again teaching. At the time, there was a great need for interpreters for Bosnian refugees in the area in Berlin where I was. So I did a lot of interpreting for refugees between German and Croatian or German and Bosnian, which was not terribly well paid, but there was a great demand. And I was you get pressed into service, as one does in some of these situations. Okay. There's also an element of activism as well that was there.
You were doing it for love?
Well, love, not quite love. But
not money, love, but love.
Well, situations present themselves because I've done it also as a child, etc.
In Australia, then?
Yeah. Also overseas when we went back, etc. I was doing it for other people into English.
Okay.
So that's something that I have done, but there was a huge demand, and lots of literally at that time in Berlin, half the streets were full of refugees because they were in these small barracks, and during the daytime hours they just spent their time on the streets. So wherever you went, there were Bosnians everywhere. You know? And that was another episode in my life. So I didn't actually start my PhD until I was 29, and I did my PhD in Social Linguistics. We're really looking at language contact phenomena, in particular morphosyntax and code switching.
Yeah, so you're looking at the narrow linguistic aspects.
I was, yes.
Yeah. And more recently your research has become more
ethnographic as well, yes. So, I mean, I've had training in social linguistics and also morphosyntax, so, you know, I can look at the grammatical structures of sentences and analyse, and I'm interested in code switching still, where it's possible, in between which elements in a sentence and where it's not, because there are rules which appear to govern this.
Although interpreters and translators are not allowed to.
No, they're not. In theory. No. Well, I have a PhD student who's looking at code switching and interpreting because, you know, although that might be the textbook view, we all know that interpreters deal with clients who do have some proficiency in English who wish to display this, and so there's often both languages participating in their discourse, and interpreters have to deal with it. You can't tell people, you know, to speak monolingually, please. But, you know, that's part of your work.
So when did you come to research? I mean, you did your PhD. Where was that? In
I did it here. At Monash.
At Monash, okay.
And that was completed in 2000.
Okay.
And then I was in Europe afterwards. I was in Vienna mainly, and I had studied there before in 1990, 1991. I was also back in Croatia, and then I came back to Australia in 2003. Was working at Monash, had other jobs, etc. Then one thing.
I was just looking at your publications. It sort of takes off really quickly.
Yes, it
in
does.
recent years, you've been incredibly productive.
The thumb screws have also been applied, so that's
right.
also part of it. But look, I'm also getting a bit old, so you have a sense of there are so many topics out there, and so I've been exploring more lately than perhaps I had done in younger years.
Okay. What kind of research do you think is needed? Not just in Australia, but in general, in translation studies. What would you like young doctoral researchers to think about, for example?
I'd like them to undertake field work, because I think that field work is advantageous for many reasons. The data that you come across will always be a bit different from what you expect, and data is a wonderful thing because it takes you places where you don't perhaps expect to be taken and forces you to do things that you might not want to do. Data is also something that can usually be looked at from many angles, and so it can become a rich source for lots of different perspectives. They can be ethnographic, they can be sociolinguistic, they can be discourse pragmatic, they can be whatever you want. If it's actually audio recorded data of interactions between people, whether it's monolingual or bilingual. So I think I like empiricism because it forces a tradition of looking at data and producing evidence to support what you claim. I think is often something which I don't find in all research papers that I read, and I'm interested to see if you wish to make this claim, do you have things to back it up? Mm-hmm. I'm not decrying theorists who sort of want to go out and say things and sort of bounce around ideas. I think that that's a very important part of all areas of the humanities and social sciences. But I think here in Australia, as well as in most countries where you kind of have, let's say, horizontal structures, hopefully, at the government level or at the university level to support getting out there to see what's happening outside your doorstep. Australia is an interesting place because I mentioned before Auslan, Indigenous, migrant languages was all the languages represented here. I'm interested in ethnographic research, which is being quite involved and being a participant, almost being an observer and participant in situations. But also looking at attitudes, which you can measure through other tools, such as questionnaires, which are more removed. Those are my areas of interest, as well as a few others.
Okay, Jim, thanks very much.
You're welcome, Anthony.
Right.